January 15th, 1919, Boston, Massachusetts. In the heart of the city's north end, a 50-foot-tall structure begins to tremble. Witnesses hear a low rumble, then a sharp, stuttering crackle, like a storm of machine gun fire ripping through the air. And then their world turns brown. A massive wave, up to 25 feet high, tears through the city at 35 miles per hour. But this isn't a wave of water. It's hot, sticky, and dark. It's a flood of industrial molasses. This bizarre river of sweetener-flattened buildings buckled a solid steel elevated train track and hurled trucks into the harbor. It swallowed men, women, children, and horses, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable devastation. In its wake, 21 people would be dead and over 150 injured, many suffocating in the very substance meant to sweeten their world. How could this possibly happen? How could a simple foodstuff, a byproduct of sugar, become one of the strangest and most lethal disasters in American history? The answer is a story of war, ambition, and criminal negligence. It's the story of a ticking time bomb, hiding in plain sight, created by a powerful corporation that simply chose to look the other way. This is the hidden history of the Great Molasses Flood, a cautionary tale that started with a terrifying roar just before the world was swallowed by a sticky, silent death. To understand how a city could drown in molasses, you have to understand Boston in the early 20th century. The North End, where our story takes place, was a bustling, densely packed waterfront neighborhood. It was a vibrant melting pot, home mostly to working-class Italian and Irish immigrant families. Life was lived on the streets, in tenement buildings that stood shoulder to shoulder, all under the shadow of the elevated railway that snaked through the city. It was a tight-knit community, carved out on the edge of the Atlantic. And on the edge of that community, at 529 Commercial Street, stood a monstrous steel tank. It was colossal, 50 feet high and 90 feet across, an imposing feature on the skyline. It was painted a drab brown, and for the residents of the North End, it was just another piece of the industrial landscape, a strange, groaning landmark that often wept sticky brown tears down its sides. The owner of this tank was a company called Purity Distilling, but that was just a name. The real power was its parent company, United States Industrial Alcohol, or USIA. In the 1910s, USIA was an industrial titan, and its business was booming for two reasons: war and prohibition. World War I had created an insatiable demand for munitions, and a key ingredient in smokeless gunpowder and dynamite was industrial-grade ethanol. The cheapest, most efficient way to produce millions of gallons of ethanol was by fermenting molasses. So the thick, dark syrup left over from sugar refining was no longer just for cookies and rum. It was a critical component of the modern war machine. USIA saw a golden opportunity, secured lucrative government contracts, and watched its profits soar. To meet this demand, they needed a massive supply chain. Molasses was shipped from the Caribbean, from places like Puerto Rico and Cuba, to American ports. Before, USIA bought its molasses from a supplier in South Boston, but cutting out the middleman meant higher profits. So in 1915, in a rush to capitalize on the wartime boom, USIA built its own massive storage tank right on the Boston waterfront. The location was perfect. Ships could unload their sticky cargo directly, and the molasses could then be piped to USIS distillery in nearby Cambridge. But there was another incentive fueling the company's rush. The temperance movement was gaining unstoppable momentum. By January 1919, the 18th Amendment, which would outlaw alcohol, was on the verge of ratification. In fact, it would be ratified on January 16th, the day after our story takes place. USIA was, in a race against time, trying to produce as much beverage-grade alcohol as possible before the nation went dry. That giant tank on Commercial Street was serving two masters: the war effort abroad, and the last call for alcohol at home. Every drop of molasses in that tank was liquid gold. But the tank itself, the vessel of the company's profits, was a catastrophe waiting to happen. From day one, it was a monument to negligence. The man in charge of its construction was Arthur Gell, USI Treasure. He was a finance guy, not an engineer. He had zero architectural or engineering experience. The project was rushed, and corners were cut at every turn. Modern analyses have revealed just how flawed it was. The steel plates used for the walls were drastically too thin in some places, half as thick as they should have been to support the pressure of 2.3 million gallons of fluid. The steel itself was a low manganese variety, which made it brittle, especially in the cold. It was a metallurgical fact that engineers of the era didn't fully understand, but it was a fatal flaw. The tank was basically designed to shatter. On top of that, the riveting was shoddy. The stress on the rivet holes was dangerously high, creating perfect points for cracks to begin. And most damning of all, the company skipped the most basic safety test. A tank of this size should have been filled with water first to check for leaks. Arthur Gell and USI decided not to, calling it an unnecessary delay. The consequences were immediate. From the very first day it was filled in 1915, the tank leaked. It didn't just drip. It wept streams of molasses. Employees raised alarms, pointing out the streams running down the sides. One laborer even brought shards of flaked-off steel from the tank directly to Arthur Gell's office as proof of the danger. Gell's reported response was dismissive. "I don't know what you want me to do." The tank still stands. The leaks got so bad that the company made a cynical decision. They painted the entire structure a dark, molasses brown to hide the weeping streams from public view. But the residents of the North End knew. They couldn't miss it. The tank became a local landmark for all the wrong reasons. Kids from the neighborhood would bring buckets and jars to the base of the tank to collect the sweet drippings to take home as a treat. It was a game, a source of free candy, played at the foot of a loaded gun. Beyond the leaks, there were the sounds. The tank groaned. When new, warm shipments of molasses were pumped in, mixing with the colder molasses already there, the tank would rumble deeply. The metal would creak and shudder. For the families living nearby, these ominous sounds became a part of daily life, a metallic symphony of dread they slowly got used to. It was just the sound of the big tank. For 4 years, this metal beast sat on the waterfront, groaning, weeping, and vibrating. It was a slow-motion failure that everyone could see, but that the men in charge refused to acknowledge. Every warning was ignored. Profit was king, and the tank, for all its groans, was still standing. But on January 15th, 1919, its time was up. January 15th, 1919, started as a strange break from the bitter Boston winter. The temperature had shot up dramatically, from a frigid 2 degrees Fahrenheit the day before to an unseasonably mild 41 degrees. The waterfront was humming with its usual lunchtime activity. Horse-drawn carts and motor trucks rumbled down Commercial Street. City workers, whose offices were right next to the tank, were eating their lunches outside. At the Engine 31 firehouse, a stone's throw away, a group of firefighters were playing cards after their noon meal. Nearby, kids were out playing. 10-year-old Pasquale Antosca and his friend Anthony DiStasio, along with Anthony's 10-year-old sister Maria, were gathering firewood near the tank. In his family's home overlooking the industrial giant, a bartender named Martin Clougherty was fast asleep. Life was proceeding as normal, under the shadow of the great brown tank. But inside that tank, a perfect storm was brewing. Just 2 days earlier, a ship had delivered a fresh, warm load of molasses, topping off the tank. This warm liquid mixed with the older, colder molasses at the bottom, creating enormous internal stress. The rising temperature outside was causing the tank's steel to expand. At the same time, Fermentation was likely producing carbon dioxide gas, cranking up the pressure even more. The tank, already weakened by its shoddy construction and brittle steel, was being pushed to its absolute limit. It was a bomb, and the fuse was lit. At approximately 12:40 p.m., a moment of failure arrived. It didn't start with a single boom. Instead, witnesses described a series of terrifying sounds. First, a deep rumble that shook the ground. Then, almost instantly, a sound that would be seared into every survivor's memory. A rapid, sharp, deafening staccato, like a machine gun. It was the sound of hundreds of steel rivets popping out of their holes, shooting through the air like bullets. Then came a final, awful, tearing roar. The steel skin of the tank ripped apart, and 2.3 million gallons of molasses, weighing an astonishing 13,000 tons, were unleashed on the city of Boston. This wasn't just a flood. It was an explosion. The initial blast of air was so powerful, it lifted a truck clean off the street and threw it into Boston Harbor. It created a vacuum effect, sucking buildings inward before the wave even hit. And then came the wave itself. It was a monstrous wall of dark, viscous fluid, estimated to be up to 25 feet high. And it was moving with the speed of a freight train, surging through the streets at 35 miles per hour. Molasses is about 1.5 times denser than water, giving the wave an incredible destructive force. It didn't flow. It bulldozed. It carried with it the debris of everything it destroyed: splintered wood, twisted metal, bricks, and huge, sharp pieces of the tank itself. A massive section of the tank's wall slammed into the support columns of the Boston Elevated Railway, which buckled instantly, the steel girders twisted like pretzels. An approaching train managed a screeching, miraculous stop just moments before it would have plunged to the street below. For those on the ground, there was no time to react. The world simply turned dark and violent. The children gathering firewood were among the first to be engulfed. A newspaper later wrote that buildings cringed up as though they were made of pasteboard. The Engine 31 firehouse was knocked clean off its foundation, the second story collapsing into the first, trapping the firefighters. The home of Martin Clougherty, the sleeping bartender, was demolished, swept from its foundation, and smashed to pieces. The public works building was flattened, killing laborers and dozens of horses in their stalls. A reporter who arrived moments later described a horrifying scene. Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky flypaper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings suffered likewise. Young Anthony DiStasio was picked up by the wave and hurled against a lamppost, but survived. His sister, 10-year-old Maria, and their friend Pasquale Antusca were not so lucky. Maria was one of the 21 people who lost their lives. Martin Clougherty awoke to find his house collapsing around him. He was thrown into the dark current, but managed to grab his own bed, now floating in the torrent. He spotted his sister struggling nearby, pulled her onto the mattress, and used it as a life raft. Their mother, however, died in the wreckage. Firefighter George Leahy was trapped in the collapsed firehouse. He and his fellow firefighters found themselves in a crawl space with molasses slowly rising around them. For hours, Leahy fought to keep his head above the suffocating goo, but exhaustion eventually took over. He became another victim, drowned not by water, but by syrup. As the waves slowed, spreading over several city blocks, the cold January air began to work on it. The molasses rapidly cooled and thickened, transforming from a wave into a deadly, gelatinous trap. It became like quicksand. Those not killed by the initial impact were now caught in a sticky, inescapable bog. The chaos of the blast was over. The long, grim struggle for life had just begun. The Great Molasses Flood is a powerful reminder of how quickly the world can be turned upside down. It's a bizarre and tragic piece of hidden history that deserves to be remembered. If you're finding this story as fascinating as we do, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us continue to unearth these incredible stories from the past. Now, back to the desperate struggle for survival in the sticky streets of Boston. In the immediate aftermath, chaos reigned. The North End was a war zone of debris and darkness, coated in a treacherous layer of brown goo. But out of the chaos, heroes emerged. The first responders weren't just police and firefighters, but 116 cadets from the USS Nantucket, a training ship docked nearby. They ran from their ship and plunged into the knee-deep molasses, beginning the desperate work of pulling survivors from the muck. Boston Police Patrolman Frank McManus saw the tank collapse and had the presence of mind to use a police call box to send out the alarm. "Send all available rescue," he yelled. "There's a wave of molasses coming down Commercial Street." Soon, the site was swarming with police, firefighters, and Red Cross volunteers. They worked through the day and into the night, their efforts hampered by the unique horror of the disaster. The molasses was a formidable enemy. It clogged equipment and made every step treacherous. Rescuers themselves got stuck, needing to be pulled out by their colleagues. A makeshift hospital was set up in a nearby building to treat the wounded, who were often so completely coated in syrup it was hard to identify their injuries, or even tell if they were still alive. The cleanup was a monumental task. For weeks, the North End was a sticky mess. The molasses hardened in the cold, making it nearly impossible to clear the streets. Crews discovered that salt water was the best solvent, so fireboats were brought in to pump water from the harbor, washing the molasses into the sewer system. For months, Boston Harbor ran brown. The stickiness spread throughout the city, tracked on shoes into homes, streetcars, and subway platforms. It was said that for a time, everything a Bostonian touched was sticky, and for decades after, residents swore that on hot summer days, a faint, sweet smell of molasses still hung in the air. As the city cleaned up, the search for answers and accountability began. USIA, the powerful corporation behind the disaster, moved quickly to control the narrative. Their official explanation wasn't structural failure, but sabotage. The company claimed the tank had been blown up by anarchists. This was the era of the first Red Scare, and anti-immigrant sentiment was high, particularly against the Italian community of the North End. The idea of a bomb plot was, for some, a plausible explanation. USIA was trying to paint itself as the victim, not the perpetrator. But the victims and their families weren't buying it. They had lived next to the leaking, groaning tank for years. They knew it was a menace. In what would become a landmark legal case, 125 lawsuits were filed against USIA. They were eventually consolidated into one of the first major class action lawsuits in Massachusetts history, pitting the poor immigrant families of the North End against a massive corporation. The trial was an epic, dragging on for 6 years. Over 3,000 witnesses testified. The court appointed a single, highly respected auditor, Colonel Hugh W. Ogden, to determine the facts of the case. The plaintiff's lawyers methodically built their case, presenting overwhelming evidence of the tank's flaws. They brought in residents who testified about the constant leaks and the unnerving sounds. They presented testimony from employees who had warned management only to be ignored. The defense stuck to its anarchist theory, but in the end, the physical evidence was undeniable. The pieces of the shattered tank told their own story of steel that was too thin, rivets that were too weak, and a design that was fatally flawed. In April of 1925, Colonel Ogden delivered his verdict. He found United States Industrial Alcohol wholly and completely responsible. He dismissed the sabotage theory, concluding the tank had failed simply because it was unsound. USIA, he ruled, had compromised safety to maximize profit. Their negligence had killed 21 people. The company was ordered to pay over $600,000 in damages, the equivalent of nearly $11.4 million today. The families of the deceased received about $7,000 per victim. It was a stunning victory. But the legacy of the Great Molasses Flood goes far beyond the courtroom. The disaster became a catalyst for change. Before 1919, a company could build a massive structure like the molasses tank without a permit, let alone an engineer's review. In the wake of the flood, that all changed. The disaster led to stricter building codes and construction standards, first in Massachusetts and then across the country. For the first time, laws required licensed engineers to review and approve plans for major construction projects. The disaster made it painfully clear that public safety couldn't be left to corporate balance sheets. It helped usher in a new era of government regulation that held companies accountable. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 remains one of the strangest tragedies in American history. It was a perfect storm of bizarre physics and cold, calculated corporate greed. A story of a company that painted a tank brown to hide its own incompetence, and of a community that paid the ultimate price. But the 21 lives lost in that sticky deluge were not entirely in vain. Their story became a turning point. It forced the nation to recognize that the price of unchecked industrial ambition could be measured in human lives. The disaster in Boston's North End led to new laws and standards that have undoubtedly prevented countless other tragedies, ensuring that public safety is enshrined in law. Today, a small plaque in Boston's Popolo Park is the only official marker of the event. It quietly tells the story of the day a wave of molasses ripped through the neighborhood. But the true legacy of the flood is written in the building codes of every major city, a hidden history that reminds us that progress is often born from tragedy, and that even a river of something as sweet as molasses can leave a bitter and lasting lesson.